We're happy that everybody is here and is joining us today. There goes my bird clock. Just a few reminders before we get started. First of all, be mindful of your mic. If you have some background noise going on, you like me and my bird clock, you might want to mute yourself, and just make sure that you are unmuted when you want us to hear what you have to say. Keep your video on as much as you can. We understand it is Kentucky, and some of us don't have the best internet connection always, or if you're like me, you have limited internet capacity from time to time. So please leave those on if you're speaking. If you're not speaking or you're not in a small group session, feel free to turn those off if you need to. Just a reminder that this is a recorded session. We record these sessions so that you guys can go back and rewatch and collect those resources and hear from our presenters again if needed. And also, in case someone does miss, they can always go back and check out what they missed. And finally, take a break as needed. So if you need to step away for a second, if you need to either get yourself a drink or whatever, use the restroom, feel free to do that. Just make sure you're muted, your camera's off, and just drop us a note in the chat, like a BRB. We all know, we all get it. You don't have to tell us why. Just say BRB so that we know that you've stepped away for a moment. Just a few reminders about navigating Teams. I think we're all pretty familiar by now, but just in case, this is your people. So if you want to know who's with us today, you can click this people button and that'll tell you who's here. Here's your chat feature. So if you want to type something in the chat or follow along with the chat. Here are reactions. So if you want to give applause, a heart, a thumbs up, whatever to something that you hear, you're welcome to do that. This is breakout rooms. We have it set up so that when it is time for breakout rooms, you'll go there automatically. But if you have questions or you need something in the room, you can check this out. Also, your camera feature. This is how you turn your camera on and off. This is your mic. So if you want to mute and unmute yourself, you're going to use this button. This is the share screen. You don't need that. And this is the leave. So if you just get sick of us and you have to leave, you can push this leave button. Just a reminder of our team norms to participate respectfully and welcome multiple viewpoints. We ask that you devote your attention to those speaking and sharing. We know it's really hard on a Saturday, especially like I am super distracted today because it is beautiful outside and it's taking all of my willpower to be in this room instead of outside. But we do ask that you try your best. Do not hesitate to ask questions for clarification. You can either drop your questions in the chat or you can raise your hand and we can get to those if you prefer to ask those out loud. Always be courageous and speak your truth, but just keep in mind that you do have to own your impacts and your intentions. And most importantly, just honor our time together. Again, we just love that you guys show up every Saturday and you're here and you're attentive. Like most of you brushed your hair. It's so cool. And so just thank you all for being here and thank you for honoring our time together. Staying connected. So if you want to stay connected with your teammates, we have the Kentucky Lead SharePoint site. Again, that's a great place to see what's been happening, what's going on. We have the directory. So if you want to reach out to someone, if someone said something interesting, like, hey, I'd really like to hear more about their job or what they do, be sure to use our directory to find how to contact those people. Also, our Kentucky Leads discussion board. Lots of great discussion happening on there. Lots of people just sharing ideas and resources. So don't hesitate to use the Kentucky Leads discussion board as well. And just in case you missed it, and there goes my dog, so I'm sorry if you hear them. In case you missed it, our March session was using implementation science to improve student outcomes, and you can find the link to that session there. Hang on just a second. That is crazy. Hang on. Can you guys hear my dogs? Is it crazy? No? Oh, good. Great. Okay, then I'm going to keep going.
Just a little bit. It's not bad.
It's not bad though. Okay. Okay, so sorry. All right, so here's our agenda for the time. We have 10 o'clock, which is during our quick check-in. We'll have some updates. Then we will hop into a wonderful presentation from our guest presenter at 10:10. We'll have a break at 11. 11:05, we'll hop right back into our presentation from our presenter. 11:45, we'll do some group sharing. And 11:50 to 12 o'clock is just evaluation and wrap up. And we have some updates. So here come our updates. We have 4 big buckets of updates. And we're going to share those with you. We have updates on the Lead Summit. Oh, we don't have updates on mentoring. We're going to take that out. We're going to pause that. We have updates on discussion board and cohort 3 applications. Thomas, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Shasta. So before we get started, I do want to say I had an opportunity to see a few of our scholars at LRP last week, and I ran and hugged you. So I apologize if you're not a hugger, because I'm so much a hugger. But it was so good to see those that I had an opportunity to see at LRP. It was a great time to convene to see each other. So now I'll pivot to kind of discuss the Kentucky Lead Summit. If you all have not had an opportunity to register, please go ahead and do that. We're working with Taste out of Utah, and so they're supporting us with the logistics, and so we need to go ahead and get that information, as much information as we can in regards to the hotel and just making sure that we have an accurate or close to accurate number of those who are planning to attend. So please go ahead and register if you have not registered. The next thing that I want to discuss is the mentorship. So we've been talking about the mentorship piece, and we decided to roll that out during the summit. We thought it would be a better idea to discuss that and discuss how it may look in a more face-to-face setting. So we will discuss the mentorship piece. Our IHE partners are planning to attend because they're leading that effort, and we will be there to support. So we'll be discussing the mentorship during that time. Shasta kind of hit on the discussion board, so please remember to continue to engage with the discussion board. We are reading through those, and we're really enjoying those who are participating. So continue to have dialogue in that setting. It's very good to see how you all are taking what we see in these sessions onto the discussion board. It's really good to see. And lastly, cohort 3. So we're very excited. We are about to launch our third cohort. It's amazing to see, what we, started into where we are now. So if you know anyone that would like to apply to cohort 3, the application deadline is June 3rd. I believe we sent the information out on our DOSE listserv, as well as Kentucky Teachers, and it's on the Kentucky Leads website on KDE. So please, if you know anyone who who is wanting to get their DOE certification, level 1 or level 2, we encourage you to please ask them to apply, and we will wrap that up again on June 3rd. And one other thing that we wanted to announce as well is that Pete Heckner is no longer with Kentucky Leads, so we miss him dearly, so dearly. But he has moved on to his next chapter, and we wish him much success in that chapter. So again, Pete is no longer with Kentucky Leads. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, Bill, Shasta, Becca. We can definitely answer those questions. But our colleague Pete is no longer with Kentucky Leads. So I will turn it back over to Shasta to move us further with the agenda. And yeah, are there any questions before we move on? Okay, I don't see any questions. So Shasta, I will turn it back over to you.
Righty. Alrighty, well, I'm very happy to introduce our amazing guest speaker today. This is such a treat. Our topic is instructional support, students with low incidence disabilities, and we are very fortunate to have from the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incidence, or OCALI. I don't know if you've been to their website, but whoa, it's awesome. We have Shauna Benson with us, and she is the Program Director for Teaching Diverse Learner Center at OCALI. So, Shauna, thank you so much for joining us today. And if you wouldn't mind, just give our scholars a little bit of information about yourself, and then when you're finished with that, you can take control of the screen.
All right, sounds great. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a member for a day in your group and share a little bit of information as well. So I am the program director for the Teaching Diverse Learners Center at OCALI. OCALI has many centers within its structure. We work in partnership with our Department of Education very closely on any academic related items, transition related items, graduation, etc. So lots and lots of layers to the connections between Ocali and our centers and our Department of Education. And we also work in partnership directly with our 16 state support teams, which is our regional structure within Ohio that allows us to have a more direct connect with districts across our state. So we provide a lot of professional development, a lot of online resources and supplementary materials that both our state and region can use for their coaching, for professional learning, and other work that they're doing directly with districts across the state. We also work in partnership with the National Center for Educational Outcomes around our students with with the most significant cognitive disabilities around our 1% work. And so there's a lot of, you'll see kind of indicators that we're looking very closely not only at our state, but also a national perspective around students with complex disabilities and how to best include and support them in their academic instruction every day in all of our buildings. So I'm thrilled to be a part of your group for a day, and hopefully I can share some information that you can take back and utilize in your work in your own state. And I think there, as I've talked with your team, there are quite a few similarities, I think, between the work in Ohio, the profile a little bit, kind of the structure that we utilize in Ohio. So I think there are some connections. I will share some resources that are Ohio specific, but from our conversations, I think they will generalize also to Kentucky. And I did see something pop up in the chat. I'm going to peek at that for just a second. I think it was a question. Okay, thank you, Catherine, for saying that. That's wonderful. And I will share just very quickly, today is the last day. So Ocali hosts a conference, kind of a national conference, and it's been online for the past couple of years. It will be online again this coming year. Today is the last day for free registration to the Ocali conference. And it ends tonight at 11:59. So if you are at all interested in taking a look at the content, much of the content will be recorded. You can go back and access it later. The conference is typically held the second week in November, and I would encourage you to take a look at those resources and potentially register if you've not already heard about that. I think we did put some advertising information and a link into the materials for today. Shasta, was that in the Padlet maybe? I'm forgetting where they would locate that.
Yeah, we dropped some stuff in the SharePoint site and discussion board. But also I'm going to drop that and put it in the chat right now, just like the Ocali main page, so people can kind of navigate there.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for doing that. I appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to kind of switch gears here and pull up our content for this morning and get us started. That's okay. We'll just keep cruising in. And if you have questions along the way, please do feel free to drop those into the chat. We may have some pause points, or if it's a question that's pertinent to the content in that moment, I'm happy to pause also and kind of address some of those things as we go through the information. So I wanted to start off by really putting a foot back in the session that you had in the month prior with implementation science, and just let you know that there are many connections in the presentation today to the drivers from implementation science. So I'm hoping that you're going to see some connectedness between what we talk about here today, particularly in the areas of leadership. So we will focus heavily on your role as leaders in buildings and districts. We will talk very specifically about systems changes and system work that contributes to, in both positive and negative ways, to our students with low incidence and complex disabilities. And there are a lot of decisions made at those systems levels that we need to be very aware of, and sometimes we need to tweak or change those to get a better result for our students. And then we are going to talk a little bit at the teacher level, at the educator level. And so that could potentially include some resources that you may want to leverage or utilize for coaching and training. So I did want to kind of mention that there are some connections here between the content today and the last session that you were in. Okay, so let's start off today a little bit with a problem of practice that we see happening not just in our state in Ohio, but I hear also probably in other states through our national work. How do we best support our learners with low incidence and complex disabilities as they access the general education curriculum and participate in Tier 1 instruction and assessment with their peers? And I just want to put a reminder out there that this does include all kids. And when we say all, we truly mean all. And that does include our students who qualify to take our alternate assessment. They too should have access to Tier 1 general education kind of core instruction as well, plus the assessment piece. And we do have some students who are kind of on that border, on the fringe between they do qualify for alternate assessment and then students who don't really qualify but still need significant amounts of support. So I am going to specifically target that group or range of learners as we go through the content today. So I wanted to start off with just a very quick, like a brief minute pause and take a look at a quick chat poll. And the only thing that you really need to add into the chat, I mean, you're welcome to type detailed information, but really I'm just thinking about a number here. If you wanted to add a number to the poll in the chat, feel free to do so. So currently, in today's current work that you're doing in the state, in the districts, in the buildings, where do you currently see students participating in Tier 1 instruction, and not just in language and literacy, but in general? Where are you seeing students participate in that instruction? Are they fully included in Tier 1 over 80% of the day with peers, really in their participating member, not just sitting on the side as an observer? Are they receiving some Tier 1 instruction, but they're also being pulled out for Tier 1 instruction where they are also receiving interventions? Are you seeing that students are fully separate? So they're receiving all of their Tier 1 in a separate setting. Or, and this is the case in some of the settings that we do still see, I hate to say this, but are they not receiving Tier 1 instruction? So they are participating in school, they're going to school, but when it comes to accessing the general education curriculum, we're not really seeing them gaining access to those academic areas across the standards and subject areas. So just a quick poll. You're welcome to type one of the numbers into the chat here. So some preschools, yep, are including. Still some pull in. Yep. Great. I see a lot of twos, which is wonderful. I see some ones and twos. So you guys have some really great practices going on already. I will say that in Ohio, we still see the full range represented. So in some of our buildings and districts, we do still see a few of those threes and fours, but I'm glad to see not too many here. All right, thank you for participating in that really brief poll. Just to kind of set the stage and get our mindsets in the work, I thought it would be nice to kind of just do a little baseline connect there. All right, so I want to tap into a couple of elements of research here just to kind of, do a temperature check as to where we are as a nation, really. And we still see, according to several semi-recent findings, that we still see that a lot of students are not necessarily fully accessing Tier 1 core instruction. And until we do so, until we really ensure that all of our students are taught grade level concepts and skills with high levels of expectation, where they're getting specialized support and integrated supports within Tier 1 instruction, we really can't make assumptions about what they know and what they can do. And sadly, there are still a lot of assumptions out there. There are presumed limitations. That's why the work in presumed competence and least dangerous assumption, our work in higher ed around building dispositions in administrators and educators is critical work for us. In additional studies, there are two main barriers that are still kind of getting in the way for our students with complex and intellectual disabilities. And it's still that belief system that people happen to judge based on outward appearance, based on communication abilities or lack of, motor complexities, sensory complexities for students. So there are a lot of practices still that are based system-wide at the district level, even at the state and national level sometimes, that are built on these false assumptions. And we do still see that limited exposure to that full tier 1 core content to build foundational skills in language, literacy, and other academic areas is still a huge challenge and barrier for many of our students. So just kind of acknowledging those things, keeping those things in mind, we want to try our best to move past that and really put practices in place that provide students with full access. And sadly, when we have those dispositions that are kind of lurking around still, we still see students who are excluded, sometimes from tier 1 inclusive classrooms, sometimes even from buildings or even district programs into segregated settings. Unfortunately, so we still see that around the nation. We do see the use of alternate curricular tools and curricular programs, which makes it really complicated for students when they're trying to participate in inclusive learning in a certain subject area, when there's a totally separate curricular tool that's being used. And we do see that sometimes the separation of students also separates the educators. And so that then can lead to even professional development that's separated or removed from one another, where we don't have collaborative PD happening, but sometimes professional development by licensure. So in a district, intervention specialist on a PD day may get separate professional learning than content specialists. So some of those things can present barriers to collaboration and inclusive practices. Now, if we swing the pendulum totally the other direction, sometimes what we see is that when districts are really passionate about inclusive education and equity, sometimes we see this tendency where we just want to get all the kids right away into tier 1 classes. So it's almost like this parachute effect where every kid is kind of, moved out of whatever LRE that they were in that was more exclusive, and really plugging them into these inclusive settings. But sometimes that happens so fast that there's not a time period of learning for that change to occur. And we'll talk a little bit about the layers of learning that have to happen, possibly the layers of change to systems and practices. But sometimes when students are like plugged into tier 1 learning without pre-design, they may be there in body, but they may not necessarily be there as an active participating member of a learning community. They may not have all the tools, materials, and instructional elements that really will support them to engage in the learning. And so we have to kind of avoid these two opposite pendulum swings and find something in the middle that will work for everyone. And so I want to focus our attention today on a couple of different change agents or change buckets. We are going to look at the systems change level. We're going to look at change at the administrative level. We'll look at the change levels also for our educators, both in general education and in intervention. There are a lot of positive things that we can do, even taking a look at the structures we have in place and possibly tweaking them a little bit. So hopefully as we go through this content, you'll be very reflective on your current systems, your current practices, decisions, et cetera, and maybe can pinpoint some things where you may want to go back and address some additional change. I do want to focus on making sure that we understand that, of course, everybody has this long-term vision and outcome that we are going to educate all of our students in PK through 12 or PK through 21 in some cases, to make sure that every student is well equipped for life after school, and graduation is a part of that. This is an Ohio-specific document. There's a link that you're welcome to visit if you are interested in taking a look at the layers of graduation requirement. This is actually a 2-page document, so it does continue on from this page. But I wanted to call out that the very first layer of requirement is that our students are gaining credits. And I would hate to think that learners are getting to the end of their programming in high school, and all of a sudden there's this lack of information to lead to those high school courses. So they may not have had full core instruction in earlier grades, and it leaves a lot of skill gap there. And then they're trying to take those high school courses and earn those credits. And sometimes that could be a very real barrier for them actually achieving graduation. So we want to make sure that we get first things first, and we cover the basics, and FAPE is definitely part of that basics package to get to graduation. So let's move into systems change. So the number one thing that I can just emphasize is that all of our students are Tier 1 learners first and foremost, and that does include our students with complex disabilities, those who take alternate assessment, any student under that umbrella of low incidence. We have to envision them and see them as Tier 1 learners first, and that also includes a reflection on how they enter our system. How do they enter into buildings, classrooms, rosters, etc.? We still sometimes see practices where students are entering into an education system where there's almost this funnel effect. I actually have a graphic, I didn't include it here today, but this funneling effect where some of our students are rostered separately to interventionists rather than to general educators. And so sometimes that actually starts this trajectory of thinking and trajectory of LRE that may be less inclusive and further away from the full scope of Tier 1 instruction and assessment. So we want to make sure that the practices that we have in place at the systems level for all of our students kind of entering in really lead us down that pathway of full inclusion, full access to general education curriculum with layers of support and service. So we don't want to discount that they're just magically going to be there and learn, but we also want to make sure the system has in place those collaborative opportunities and things of that nature. We also have to be on the lookout for things that predetermine a student's LRE placement. So in some districts, again, we still see that LRE is determined by category or identification, or sometimes qualification to participate in an alternate assessment. Sometimes those parts of a learner's profile can sometimes lead to a certain LRE. And that's not really as the law has intended. So we have to go back and clarify at the systems level that those things are happening so that we can address them in the implementation levels. And of course, that culture for collaboration, just the way we talk about and listen to learners and educators in our system is really important. We need to have make sure everybody is heard, that if barriers are occurring, we're really listening to those kinds of things. And that when we have systems and structures in place, things like MTSS or OIP, or and that OIP is the Ohio Improvement Process. So a structure of data analysis, data collection, and planning for intervention. So those cycles are really important, and those may be a district-wide structure, but does that structure include all educational professionals, from intervention specialists, other specialists, content specialists, and all learners? Are they all represented in the data? Are they all represented in the decision making? Are they all represented in the instructional plan? So all of those things really come into that systems piece. There are a lot of decisions that administrators also make on a regular basis. So we're heading down from that systems to more of an administrative level. Many opportunities for administrators to make change and ensure that every student has a place and that they're welcome within the district and in the building, and that includes their families. So let's take a look at a couple of those layers of opportunity and possible layers of change. So of course, scheduling comes into play at that kind of building administrative level. What does the scheduling look like? Have we paved the way for collaborative planning within the schedule, collaborative implementation for students who need it within the schedule? Have we promoted universal ownership of all the students? So team members who are surrounding support at a grade level, do they think and feel and really react when any student in that grade level needs some support? Are we shaping our language, how we speak about learners? Our administrators in your role modeling people first language, and for some learners, if they've expressed that, identity first language. So we want to make sure that the way we're speaking about is a model for how we expect our educators and other specialists within our buildings to be speaking about learners. Are we presuming competence? Are we modeling that? Are we sharing that every student belongs, no matter the extensive range of need for support that they may have? They all have a place, and that we're going to make sure to support them and their families within this education process. Administrators are sometimes the listening ear. They hear a lot of feedback from families, from educators, sometimes from learners as well. And sometimes when I'm visiting schools or teams where the conversation of learners who have the most complex needs comes up, I still sometimes from time to time hear that we don't do that here, or we don't have that here. So we can't possibly support this group of learners or a learner here. And so from a leadership perspective, we want to kind of flip that script, and we want to make sure that we're always thinking positive first. What can we do to make this all the supports and services available for a particular student or group of students? And with the right team, we're going to figure it out. So there are some additional layers that administrators can take on. Number one is just being that listening ear, and not that you're listening to commiserate, but you're listening to problem solve. And who can we bring in if we don't have the expertise of one type or another on our team? It's not a guarantee. I mean, our kids come in with very diverse profiles, and sometimes they come in with profiles with characteristics or elements that we've never seen before. And we may not have expertise within the walls of our building or district. We need to find and seek out layers of expertise sometimes to bring to our teams to best support them, so that they in turn can best support the learners. Setting clear expectations and guidelines to make sure that everybody's included, that everybody, every student in our building feels welcome. We want to make sure that that is expressed every single day to our students, to our teachers. And it's not just an expression, but you're actually monitoring it, you're upholding it. And if sometime you hear something that doesn't quite fit within that context, we address it. And so sometimes that is a preventative. We're heading things off before it goes down the wrong road. And so that listening ear definitely, and problem solving attitude can definitely help in that situation. So what does it really take for students to get their foot in the door of Tier 1 instruction? And this does take us into that layer of general education and intervention. And again, they're the ones every day who need the supports to make sure all of the students can participate, do feel welcome, that peers are understanding, and that they have a role as well. So learners, peers are working together also. So I think one of the things that we can do to kind of focus our attention the most is making sure that we're thinking about how do we take all of these supports profiles from learners who are very diverse, who are coming into a specific grade level, our building as a whole, a specific classroom. How do we make sure that all of those supports and services from the sections of their IEPs with assistive technology and accommodations and specially designed instruction, that they don't just sit somewhere in a digital file, and that the interventionist knows about them, possibly IEP team members revisit them one time a year? That's not enough. We need to make sure all of those supports and services come out of those individualized service plans. And this can include behavior intervention plans. It can include supports for English learners, and it can also include supports for students who are gifted or twice exceptional. We want to make sure all of those supports and services plans, that detail comes out of those documents. They're not sitting in a dusty file somewhere, virtual or paper. And we're using that information every single day. So teachers have a way to put all that great information from those service plans to work every time they're instructing, every time they design, select, or implement an assessment, all of that information from that diverse body of learners is right at their fingertips while they're planning for all of those things. When it's not, sometimes we forget, and we forget to include very specific, sometimes evidence-based practices and other supports. So I want to think about all of those potential elements that could be part of a specialized learning plan. And I do want to call out that there are clearly evidence-based practices in general for general populations. I think, of course, of Hattie research and other bodies of research that really help us identify high yield practices and strategies. And so I'm including that in this mix. I'm just not going to talk specifically about it. But we have to continue to understand that along with that kind of research that are general evidence-based practices, we also have bodies of research that are subgroup specific. So when I think about our learners under this low incidence or complex disabilities umbrella, I think about learners who have multiple disabilities, intellectual disabilities. I think about learners who have autism spectrum disorder. I think about learners who have sensory disabilities, those who are blind, visually impaired, those who are deaf, hard of hearing. Every single one of those groups of learners has evidence-based, research-based practices that are coming out of very specific pockets of research in addition. So oftentimes we may see some of these specific evidence-based practices across the board within specialized learning plans that have to become part of everyday instruction and intervention. And so just thinking about what can we do at the general education level to make sure that those practices are really part of what we know to do every single day, whether or not we have an interventionist in our classroom in that moment. So these are going to address, I'm going to cover general education first, and then I'll go into intervention. But there are some layers of support that I think we could better include in everyday planning for instruction, implementation of instruction and assessment, and collaboration. So the biggest piece around planning is, do our teachers have a structure for planning? Number one, a time, which we talked about at the administrative level. So we have a time to plan. All the right people are at the planning table. And then do we have a structure for planning, some type of a planning hub that's collaborative and everybody can access? Do we have a planning framework, a template, or whatever the teacher team is using to make sure that we're addressing the targeted content for the grade level and subject area? So Ocali does have some planning frameworks and coaching videos that I'll share toward the end. Our planning frames for collaborative planning for Tier 1 include 3 essential layers. They include the identification of the learning targets and standards that could potentially include extended standards if your state has extended. So it's always the general standard. We're noting if extended standards exist, but we're also noting a full learning progression. And we'll talk a little bit more about learning progressions in the next section here, but it's not just about naming the standard, but it's about knowing when we unpack that standard, all of the significant elements of knowledge and skill that are part of that standard. There are no hidden skill sets. Sometimes we ask, from an educator standpoint, we ask students to do something very simple, what we think is very simple. For example, write a sentence. So when a teacher makes that request to a student, just write a sentence. It's super simple. If I unpack writing a sentence, there are many layers of skill that a student would have to not only know about, understand, but also demonstrate in order to put that full sentence together. Everything from the writing aspects to the spelling aspects, which requires encoding, so sound symbol correspondence. They have to know word order. They have to get the thought in their mind to begin with, so that almost executive function of thinking through the problem, getting the idea constructed, and then of course putting it onto the paper, making sure that it has the right capitalization, punctuation, all of those layers. So every time we think of planning and general educators think of planning, I want them to kind of broaden their thinking about what it is they're actually going to implement within a teaching structure, and possibly what they're assessing as well. And we'll talk about explicit instruction, which was one of those evidence-based practices, and why learning progressions or unpacking standards is so critical to that. But this should be done collaboratively. Sometimes when you teach a specific subject or grade level, you kind of almost get blinders on to the requirements of that grade level. But we do know that a lot of our students are entering into that grade level or that skill, and they may not have all the foundational understandings quite yet. And so we have to understand, what does it take to dip back without hanging out back there, and then bringing everybody along. And that can be achieved through those explicit instruction routines. And we want to make sure that our general educators are participating in grade level planning that includes interventions. So definitely collaboration with others is required for part of this. And the thinking that sometimes tier 2 interventions and specially designed instruction, again, in an explicit instruction routine, could potentially be integrated at times, rather than a student having to go somewhere separate with someone separate to receive those elements of support. And then being mindful about curricular tools, programs, and materials. Have we screened those materials and tools not only for content alignment, but also for accessibility? And there's another resource that I'll share, an online website that we just put together this summer, and one of the chapters specifically addresses that particular need. So we do know that sometimes this may mean a change from kind of traditional structures of instruction, that very heavily focused attention on a textbook, or possibly curricular tools or materials that were prepackaged, and that traditional almost lecture style. But we want to make sure that students are also experiencing concepts and content in life applied ways. And there are structures for planning that open that door a little bit more than always just kind of rotely following a curricular tool. Sometimes we have to get off of that programmatic outline in order to really understand and bring some of our students into the content. They may not fit the bill or fit the mold for the curricular tool as it was designed. So I want to bring us back to that evidence-based practice of explicit instruction. There are a lot of elements within explicit instruction that, for some of our students who need more base building, they don't necessarily have all of the foundational skills entering into that grade level learning. There are ways during instruction in the I do, we do section, teachers can dip back to where everybody's proficiency areas are, or where they're comfortable with learning, where they have their baseline understandings, and then build back forward in the we do section, making sure that every single student is on that learning train as we continue to get closer and closer to that grade level target. We want to make sure that sometimes there are pre-teaching elements that are part of our explicit instruction routine. Is that a natural part of the planning for some of our general educators, or is that something that would need collaborative support? Grade level text is, of course, the target for all of our instruction, but knowing that some of our students, even with assistive technology, may not be able to read that grade level text cold and really make meaning from it. And so our teachers really thinking about text sets that scaffold from movies and other non-text-based materials, bringing students around in concepts, building little chunks of information along the way before we go into that grade level text. So there are elements of scaffolding here that we could potentially always integrate from a general ed standpoint. Sometimes the way we plan, sometimes the way curricular tools are set up, there's a very quick pacing where you cover a standard a day almost. And we do know that from students with complex disability standpoint, that approach is not long enough in the content to really build understanding, build mastery through practice, and really retain that information. So sometimes we may have to revisit the structure of how the lessons unfold. So maybe we're clustering concepts together and we're staying with them for a longer period of time in some of that topical content. So it does give them enough time to really live in the vocabulary, live and experience the content, so that they can hopefully retain it for a longer period. And again, making sure that we're working on those dispositions and attitudes of ownership. I did include a couple of examples when we were thinking about learning progressions. These are a couple of examples that came from some of our Ohio teachers. The one on the top is a learning progression that we saw in an elementary classroom where teachers were taking a standard, they were unpacking it, and they were showing students along this little mapping structure all of the different skills that they were going to be learning kind of day by day throughout the weeks in order to get to that learning target at the end. And there were a couple of different X marks the spot checkpoints there where they were going to be checking in on their learning to see how well they were doing. With learning progressions like this, the one on the bottom is a high school example where the teacher put the learning progression up on a whiteboard and students drew avatars that represented themselves. And they were monitoring and tracking their own progress. And we know that from a lot of the Hattie research, that really is a high yield strategy where students are really engaged in their own kind of the monitoring and follow along of their own learning. They're gauging where they are, what they know currently, what they already know in the past, where their next learning point or target is, and then how far they need to go to accomplish the end goal for the grade level. So these are some examples that I thought I would share. And when we help students and teachers understand the progression as a whole, we can also help them identify from a formative assessment standpoint, possibly even present levels of performance. These are skills along the way with the check marks that the student knows and can do, and the gradient here of color. On the right-hand side, there's a very light blue section that's called building the base, and those are skills that would be outside of the grade level itself, but are connected skills that are foundational to grade level learning. In the mid zone, where it's this kind of general teal color, those are grade level skills of the grade level standard that's been deconstructed. And then there are skills on the left that go beyond grade level learning. And so you can kind of see here the check marks show the student knowledge currently, but it also shows that they have some skill gaps along the way. And if we can start to talk about data in this way, more diagnostic, more explicit, more detailed, I think that both teachers and students will be better able to identify and work on targeted skills that are missing, as opposed to trying to blanket over everything again. Sometimes there's student frustration when we try to go back and teach things that they already know. And so we want to make sure that we're very specific if we're targeting interventions. So that's just one example of how we may do some of that tracking for formative. And students then can also talk about their own learning, their own growth targets, and possibly their own areas of need. Now, from an intervention standpoint, we want to make sure that interventionists are also addressing, kind of keeping in check and addressing changes they may need to make in their practices to make sure our students are well supported in inclusive settings and that we can leverage natural resources in those settings. Of course, grade level teachers with grade level content knowledge, a wonderful natural resource in a setting in Tier 1, but also peers, peer supports as opposed to layering in many paraprofessionals or aid supports is sometimes something we need to think about. One of the biggest challenges though, and this I'll include families in this layer as well, for families and specialists sometimes, is letting go of control. For many of our students who have complex disabilities, historically, they've been served by specialists in segregated settings for a long period in our history. And so, knowing that those settings have many layers of support that were kind of naturally built in, smaller class sizes, layers of supports and services with therapies and things of that nature, adapted equipment, differentiated tools, methods, and materials. Those were all part of those natural supports in those settings. Sometimes intervention specialists will want to remain in control of students until, remember that parachute graphic where we were thinking about parachuting kids into a setting that may or may not be ready for them? Interventionists are going to put a tight hold on kids and not release them until those settings are right for kids. And sometimes families will do the same thing. So we have to be mindful that there has to be this really powerful connection and collaboration between interventionists and content specialists, so they can build trusting relationships, so that there's no reason to contain kids in a separate space, so that we can control and make sure they have everything that they need. We want students to have what they need in any of the settings in which they're learning. And that can only happen when we really have had collaborative conversations, pre-planning to make sure those supports and differentiated materials are there. And sometimes training. Some of our students need a lot of layers of assistive technology for access. Everybody on the grade level team needs to know how to operate, support, troubleshoot those kinds of tools in those general education settings as well. And the more we can get this collaboration to happen, I think the more we can set the stage in that direction. And interventionists and families will feel more and more welcome, more and more comfortable, and they'll let students go and experience, and knowing that they're going to be supported there. So definitely thinking about what does instruction look like and assessment. So I want to make sure we're also emphasizing the assessment piece. When students are participating in Tier 1 instruction, it's really critical that interventionists are kept in the loop to ensure that those supports and services are layered into everyday instruction. And then when it comes time for assessment, whether it's a screening, a benchmark assessment, of course, state assessments, or formative even, that those layers of support are always available to the student. And so they're not experiencing barriers while they're trying to show what they know. There's a hesitancy from an intervention standpoint to give an assessment to a student that won't show that student's knowledge in the best light. And when some of those supports and services are not available to students, they experience barriers that they really can't compensate for. And sometimes we get false negative data that doesn't truly represent what students know in that moment in time. But the integration of students appropriate accommodations, scaffolds, assistive technology, accessible educational materials, when those are in place, the students really don't have to experience those barriers during assessment, and they really can show what they know, and we can get a better profile of what they know in that moment. Sometimes intervention specialists will also need to build their own content knowledge to be a participating member in a specific grade level. So just be keeping that on the radar. And likewise, content specialists may need to build their knowledge in some of these elements that are special ed specific. Yeah.
Sorry, Shauna,
Yeah.
really quickly, I just wanted to give us a time check. It is 10:52, so we've got
Awesome.
about 8 minutes before our break.
Awesome. I think we'll have a little bit of a pause point right before, so maybe if there's a question, we should have a smidge of time right before break to do that too.
Perfect.
Thank you for that reminder. We want to make sure that every time data is discussed, and we talked about that back in our system structure, sometimes we're using multi-tiered systems of support where we have data-based conversations at the subject level, building level, grade level, classroom level. When that analysis is done, and when we are having those team or collaborative meetings for decision making around data, or even planning for upcoming intervention or instruction, we want to make sure that all team members are representing the learners in the class or the grade level. And we use this mirroring graphic intentionally here to represent that we have a variety of students with a variety of profiles in our classes. And when we get to the place where we're planning and talking about data, we have to have people at the table who mirror the learners that we have represented. So if we have students who are learning English, or who are, whose L1 is not English, we need to make sure on our data analysis and planning team, we have somebody who represents that group of students. Likewise, if we're talking about students with complex disabilities being integrated and included in Tier 1 assessment and instruction, we need representation at our table when those conversations are happening. So from an administrative standpoint, it's not just that we're scheduling time for people to meet, but are all of our representatives there? Are they able to be participating members in the time of those conversations? And not that every person has to be there for every meeting, not every conversation is the same, but when those conversations are pertinent to groups of learners and specifics to planning, we want to make sure that they're at the table. And we want to make sure that each member of the team has a voice. So there has to be a place and a space for their voices to be heard, for the content that they want to integrate to support learners. It has a place in a planning hub to sit. So making sure the tools are available where they can integrate those supports and services. That's one of the other layers in our planning frame, is the integration of supports and services. So to kind of like wrap up this intervention piece and set the stage for our segment coming after our break, there are some definite changes for interventionists. They need to be thinking about independence in students rather than person-centered scaffolds for students. For a long time, and this includes paraprofessionals and families, for a long time, it was thought that if you weren't directly connected to the learner, doing something with them at all times, that you really weren't doing your job. And we've tried to retrain thinking, kind of reshape mindsets, that the best way to do your job is if you are an independence coach and you are constantly providing scaffolds, supports, and knowledge to the learner so that at some point they don't need your support anymore. And that's the best success that we can have for our students, that they can kind of grow their own skill sets and support themselves with peer support sometimes, or with other layers of tools. So it's not that they're not using supports at all, but they're using different supports that are not person-centered or person-directed. They shouldn't need a parapro constantly hovering by them to be able to find success, or an intervention specialist constantly in the room to find success. So we want to build those trusting relationships. Yeah, I love that phrase, independence coach, as well. We try to kind of repeat that as often as possible, so that people kind of, again, reshape their thinking a little bit. And so we've had some districts who have changed up their titling, I guess, for parapros or aides, and they have called them now independence coaches. But really thinking about being a problem-solving team member, always working with colleagues to make sure students are as supported as possible. And really their role is about modeling. They're experts in modeling for differentiation, adapting materials, using those assistive technology supports and services. So they themselves are a trainer and a coach. They could provide professional learning to their grade level team as a whole. So I think that if we reshape sometimes roles and responsibilities to include some different things, we may have better success down the road. So I'm going to pause here. We will hop back in and think about materials. In the next segment, I'm going to show a lot of adaptive materials, kind of the evidence from the field or the classroom. What does it look like when these things are in place? But I'm going to pause here for just a second and see if there are any questions before we dive into our break.
Thanks, Shauna. Does anybody have any questions or just some feedback or a comment or anything at all they'd like to share? There's been some great happenings in the chat, some connections with the conversation that Shauna's been sharing. So be sure to check those out. But does anybody have any questions?
Thank you. I just hope the content is helpful. That it sounds like you guys are doing wonderful things already in your state. So you may see familiarity in a lot of the layers that I'm talking about in that you already have in place. So definitely count those as positive checkpoints along the way. But also kind of be on the lookout, if you will, for things that you could target. That's actually what our conversation and our breakout group will be toward the end here. All right, Shasta, I'm not hearing any questions or comments.
Neither am I. In that case, we will then just go ahead and hop into a break. We will be back at 11:05. So come back and be ready to join us at 11:05 promptly. And make sure you mute yourself, turn off your camera, that sort of thing as you take your break. And we'll see you in 5 minutes. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Have ever had a chance to refill coffee or water or Mountain Dew, whatever keeps you going, sweet tea, whatever it is. Give everybody about 1 more minute to just kind of like drag in here, Shauna, and then
Okay.
we'll get started.
I'm going to pull my presentation up again, if that's okay, and kind of
Yes,
get our
perfect.
placeholder ready. You just let me know when you see most everybody is back.
Okay. All righty, Shauna, you can go ahead and get started. I'm seeing people kind of hopping on us. People aren't using their cameras and things, but you can go ahead and get started. Thank you.
All right. Sounds good. All right. Thanks everybody for being very attentive and participating in the chat. I was able to read some of the comments, and I'm thrilled that you have connected this with resources in your state. That's really awesome. All right. So in this second little chunk of content or information, I do want to share through kind of visual example some of the look-fors, if you will, that you may see in supporting learners with complex disabilities and low incidence disabilities in those academic instructional times, and then also during assessment. So it definitely is possible that, of course, full access and implementation in Tier 1 instruction it is possible, can work for students and teachers if the right supports are in place. And we just kind of outlined those things. We also know that if students are participating in more restrictive settings, of course, supports and services can happen there, as long as Tier 1 instruction is also happening there. And that's kind of that caveat piece. We want to make sure that no matter what the LRE setting, under IDEA to provide FAPE, students do have to have full access to the general education curriculum, kind of no matter what. And that includes those general targets for all of those subject areas. So we want to make sure that interventionists feel supported. It's really challenging. So this is kind of an administrative flat red flag. I still go into many school buildings and districts where interventionists have classroom time, so they do have a separate learning space where they may be either providing Tier 1 instruction and or intervention at different periods of time throughout the day. One of the red flags, though, is what I see in scheduling, where an interventionist may have a group of learners who they are supposed to be providing Tier 1 core instruction, let's say in mathematics or English language arts. And at that same time, they have students kind of popping in for intervention. There's no way humanly possible for that teacher to run a Tier 1 core instruction lesson and at the same time provide intervention for groups of students who are popping in and out to get targeted supports or targeted learning for Tier 2, Tier 3 intervention or specially designed instruction. So be very mindful about those schedules and how interventionists and students are scheduled. There needs to be clear definition. Is that time period for Tier 1 core instruction, or is that time period for targeted intervention? And if it's the second part, if it's the latter, we want to make sure that students who are coming in those intervention periods have homogeneous skill set targets. So let's say there's a 30 or 40 minute period of time, and we have students from a single grade or multiple grades coming in, let's say for math interventions. We want to make sure that the students coming at that time have common or similar intervention needs. Otherwise, it becomes the same challenge for the interventionist. They may have 5 or 10 kids coming into their classroom, but if all of those needs are very different, the time that they're actually going to have to spend on targeted interventions for any one of those students or even small groups is going to be very limited. So we definitely can't count those minutes as a whole for SDI. or for tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3 intervention. We have to be very cautious about the scheduling of how students are coming, when they're coming, and what are the other responsibilities of that intervention specialist in that moment in time. So just kind of a heads up or just a mindful piece here. All right, so let's get into the examples. And I do want to leave some time here toward the end of this chunk to do some reflective thinking and get you into some breakout groups. So within Tier 1 instruction, of course, teachers are providing a lot of different curricular materials for students. Oftentimes they fluctuate class by class, day by day. And so these are some examples that were part of online learning. So we know that school districts in the past few years have experienced a multitude of variations on where and how students were learning. So you're going to see some examples of those virtual learning experiences. And we know that from the standpoint of supporting students with complex disabilities, many of them are not independently just hopping onto a program and able to manipulate and participate in those online learning environments. So it has to be very, very structured. And so these are some examples from Tier 1 on how structures of online learning were supported with family help or sometimes at-home help and support. So if there was a time period where students were engaged in a specific type of learning, they had to go into a digital environment. Within that digital environment, there was almost a task analysis of the skills and sequence of events within that learning period that teachers were kind of coaching students. You're going to go here for a little segment of learning, and then you'll go to this next link for a segment. We'll take a little break, and then you'll go here. So those structures that we saw in a classroom that were supporting learning are replicated even if we're in a virtual or digital environment. So again, some layers of examples using text. So the teacher has selected a specific book. It's a possibility that there are embedded learning opportunities and targets within the text. So we're not just reading the book for reading's sake, although that could be one of the targets for the book, the actual reading of it. But we're also using features of text. So in this case, they were using features of letter writing. They were learning about letter writing and sending letters here and there. That gets us into that life applied learning. And again, if there are supports that are needed where students are needing checkpoints of I'm going to learn this or do this specific task, then this, then this, then this. Sometimes photographs are taken of the process that support learning. And again, if vocabulary is part of the work, possibly they're working through the decoding or encoding of words that are targets, either tier 2 or tier 3 targets of vocabulary as well as part of the learning opportunity. So for some of our students, we may have to expand the text types to include adapted versions of text. And again, just being mindful that you may walk into a classroom and see text that looks different from one learner to another, one group to another, and possibly flexible options would be offered. So some of the books could be digitized to offer additional features in text. Some may be static text. We may have adapted text books to include easier manipulation for fine motor skills, like page fluffers, where we're building out some of the pages so students can more easily turn. We may add tactile supports to some of the books to ensure that they are able to track and follow not only the text, but also get more information from the images that are part of the text as well. So sometimes our students, in addition to what's happening in Tier 1, will also need additional layers of support, and that could happen through Tier 2 intervention, either within the Tier 1 classroom, during some of that no new instruction time, in the I do, we do, you do cycle of explicit instruction. When independent practice time comes, it's a possibility that some of our students may need more we do, we do, we do, we do during that time, and that could be an example of that Tier 2 layer of support. So it's a possibility you read a book in class, we're using that information as part of a learning experience, and then there's an independent task where we're studying from a social studies, either continents, and gathering more information from a research perspective, We may be analyzing the text in some specific way, and those layers of support could also be provided to the student right within the context of that lesson. It is a possibility that if we're teaching foundational skills and literacy, we need to keep in mind that many of our students with complex disabilities have a communication component to their profile. And our students are communicators, so I would be very cautious in the way we use language to never refer to a student as nonverbal or non-communicators, because the reality is we are all communicators in a variety of ways. We communicate through facial expressions, we communicate through gestures, we communicate even through body posturing and proximity. All of those are elements of how we communicate. So I've actually never run across a learner or an individual who is non-communicative at all. And I've worked with a lot of kiddos and a lot of individuals. So we just need to keep in mind, how do students communicate? And it's always going to be multimodal. So if a student uses augmentative systems for communication or assistive technology, that's one mode of how they communicate. But they probably also are going to use gestures, facial expressions. They may even use utterances to express themselves. They may use different body gestures. So yes, no's, they could use thumbs up. There are a variety of ways that students may be layering in communication. So we need to be thinking about, if we ever walk into a classroom and see a student who is not participating and they really seem not to have opportunity or access to communicate, how are we supporting that team and that learner to find a mode and use their multi-modes of communication? And how can we integrate that into planning for instruction? We may have to integrate layers of support that are maybe already part of a student's IEP. So these assistive technology layers that are part of an IEP, we need to ensure that they are part of everyday instruction. So when we think about augmentative supports for phonology or for foundations in literacy with sound symbol correspondence, we may see tools that have added layers of support to make sounds, to be able to measure isolated sounds in students, to make sure that we understand what they know and maybe don't know with regard to those early word recognition skill sets. So we may see additional use of things like objects or tactile supports that are paired together with other learning materials, including assistive technology. And again, we may see some digital supports or digital materials that add layers of practice to something that they experience. So if students are in Tier 1 and they're going through a phonics lesson, and the phonics lesson has, like, say, 5 practice items or options, it's a possibility that some of our students may need added layers of practice. So teachers may be creating materials that are digitized that give them more and more examples. And that could link to their Tier 2 interventions or supports, in that we do section being expanded and hopefully getting students to where they can independently practice some of those skill sets as well. Sometimes access requires us to get a little bit creative and focus on engagement. How are some of our students engaging in learning? And for some students, it could be challenging to get them engaged in the activity in and of itself. So when we think about syllable segmentation for words, either through phonological awareness or for phonics, it's a possibility we may need to add music to that. And what better place to see syllables in action other than music? I mean, we had a little conversation prior to our session starting about music and how passionate people are about music. And so some of our students are equally passionate about music, and that's what engages them. So it's a possibility we may need to add layers of access features that could include things that are maybe non-customary. But we need to think about this. Actually, music is another fabulous approach when it comes to teaching mathematics and fractions. I've seen some awesome lessons in mathematics for fractional parts to wholes. And our students have these like light bulb moments sometimes when we're making the connect between the two. All right, so let's talk vocabulary. Most often in Tier 1, we hear about tiers of vocabulary, Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 vocabulary. But when we're including students with complex disabilities, we also need to be thinking about core and fringe vocabulary. And how do those two types of vocabulary cross over? How do they interconnect sometimes? How can we make a general ed and intervention connection for students who may have communication goals on their IEP? How can we make sure we're teaching both at the same time? Both the vocabulary for the content areas in which they're learning, and also kind of build in those layers of core and fringe vocabulary instruction and access while they're learning those other skill sets. So that's something you may see also as part of instruction in planning in particular. Instructionally, when we give vocabulary to students, we're not giving them in a traditional way. Our students are going to need to sometimes see the vocabulary words. Sometimes they're going to need to be able to feel the vocabulary words or experience and explore those vocabulary words. Sometimes they're going to need to know how to pronounce the words. And I would say always, not just sometimes. For some of our students, they may be reading and decoding the vocabulary words that they see. We need to be clear when a student is expected to encode those words for writing purposes. And we also need to clarify that students, while they're communicating in the classroom, they may also be including the use of these vocabulary words. For some students who use augmentative communication, they would need to know the symbol sequence. If they're a symbol user for their AAC access, they may need to know the symbol sequence to get to that term, or possibly they may need to use encoding, so writing that word to also say that term. So all of that needs to be kind of layered into the instruction, and it stretches the boundaries of what we would typically see in Tier 1 instruction and general education. So again, planning ahead, making sure we have access to all of these layers of material. I will say that I have a Padlet that I'll share at the end, and it has templates for all of these kind of documents around vocabulary and some of the other things as well. So that you can have those. You're welcome to share those with teachers that you know who may benefit from them. Clarifying for students what kinds of expectations you have around vocabulary, particularly for students with complex disabilities. Are they expected to read all the vocabulary, write all the vocabulary, spell all of the vocabulary, or just some? And when we say just some, which ones? Which words am I expected to be able to read? Which words am I expected to be able to spell? Which words, and I would hope this would be like all of the words, but which words are we supposed to understand the meaning and in context when I'm speaking or using these terms in a classroom setting? So we want to make sure that there's connection then between these terms that we're using and texts that we're also reading on a daily basis, that students are seeing the integration of the words that we're learning along the way. So in this case, the word was gigantic. And we were thinking about many of our students may be familiar with the word big. And so we're going to teach gradients of vocabulary in this case. And we may also, along the way, add in instruction for other concepts and skills. In this case, plot sequence was a skill, and even types of words or parts of language, including onomatopoeia. This book ends with some words and terminology that would be considered words that make sound. And so that is an opportunity to teach some of those skills in context of text, rather than a separate lesson on the side without any context associated with it. All right, so books, access to books. Sometimes our students may not be able to physically hold books in their hands. So we may want to start creating virtual bookshelves for students based on the topics in science and social studies or mathematics or even our English language arts lessons. We want to make sure that everybody has access to the books that the class is reading collectively. And so those virtual options are of added benefit. We do have supportive tools that we see around literacy often, making sure that students are not just focusing on pictures for reading. So that's a big, again, another one of those red flag areas. If you walk into a classroom and students with complex disabilities are focusing on picture reading, I would raise a flag and ask some questions more specifically about that. Our students do need to focus on the text at hand. They need to have books that are decodable. Sometimes that means controlled text, where they're learning a set of sound symbol correspondences, and then right away they get to practice those sound symbol associations in a book that's very decodable, highly controlled, to make sure only those sounds and symbols that they know are there, so they can really practice and gain lots of repetitions. And if they get stuck and they stumble on a word that they don't know, we're going to give them very specific strategies. That's what the backpack tools are. Those are also available in the Padlet that I'll share. But those tools should not really include looking at the text to figure, or looking at a picture to figure out the word. Okay, we want to steer them away from doing that. Pictures add meaning to books and meaning to stories, but it's not how you read the words. And so we have to clarify that sometimes for our students. So sometimes the look down at the words card, that was actually from my own classroom. And I had a lot of learners who had a tendency, when they got to a word they didn't know, they would look up at me with expectation, like, what is this word? Just tell me what it is. And so I sometimes had to say, nope, we're going to go back down to the word and we're going to figure it out together. We'll use all the strategies that we have in our backpack. We'll figure it out. Let's tackle that first sound. What is it? You know, what is the correspondence here? So being ready, kind of prepared when we know that students have certain patterns of behavior that we're going to need to kind of recorrect or redirect in some way. Those tools are really powerful. And even the reading phones, allowing students to hear themselves read, can really contribute to fluency and prosody over time. And sometimes in context of a big classroom, they're not really listening to themselves read personally. And so those do help isolate sound. Sometimes we may just need to take something in general education and we need to adapt it. So in this case, we had a teacher who was sharing the bad case of stripes. They were going through a storytelling rope, using the reading rope, a retelling sequence. And so we made a tangible, kind of tactile retelling rope that had objects that represented details from within the story along the way, and it had little Velcro points on the rope that allowed the student to also show what they know, participate in that lesson, and start to develop understandings of things like what happened at the beginning of the story versus the end versus the middle, and what was the culminating event, what was the solution, what happened in the problem. Those kinds of things also can be scaffolded with tangible supports. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit and show that sometimes some of our lessons in our classroom also connect back to IEP goals and objectives. And it's a possibility that students may need to demonstrate skills within larger skills. So maybe in the general classroom, they're working on larger skills and concepts of addition. But for a specific student or group of students, they may be working on one-to-one correspondence and counting, or number identification and quantity, those kinds of things for an IEP goal. And so these are examples of, this is an example of a kit that was created for additional layers of practice. And you can see that there are data sheets there. So not only are we collecting the data in Tier 1 around the targeted skill for grade level, but we're also collecting data for IEP goals and objectives kind of simultaneously with added layers of materials. And don't forget about science, adapting and supporting science and social studies instruction. If you have a lab activity, it's a possibility that that lab activity could include tangible materials and students are manipulating and participating, but how will we assess what they know? We may need to have an added tool. So this is just a T-chart with things that were conductors and non-conductors of electricity. This is their evidence of learning. So they may have manipulatives and they may participate, but don't forget that assessment piece. As soon as they pick something or communicate something that they know, we want to make sure that data is also accompanying their work samples or their work efforts. And likewise, when we're sorting things, habitats, animals within habitats, ecosystems. There are a lot of ways that we can create materials that our students can even use direct selection. If we're offering 2-choice, 4-choice selection, we can help them participate by making sure that they have access to recording their selections on paper or digitally, so that we can also gain grades and points for them as well. And again, just examples of sorting, properties of matter. In this case, in a high school example, we're seeing cellular structures. Can they identify the different types of cells, parts of cells, as they're going through an activity with a microscope? Those kinds of resources may be available to the student. And then it is possible, in addition to that Tier 1, Tier 2 repertoire of information and examples, that we do have students who need some direct and explicit instruction that possibly is ongoing, covering a larger scope and sequence of skills that will be an added layer of need for Tier 3 intervention, or just specially designed instruction as per their IEP. Could be both. So I think about things like using augmentative communication systems. They may need direct instruction on that system particularly, how to navigate it, what do the symbols mean, maybe even working in communities of practice where they have peers who are also using AAC at that time. So there are specific layers of support. This is the communication matrix is shown there on the left-hand side to show that the student has some very specific skill deficits that we are targeting with this intervention, and it's broad scope. And likewise, we may have students, I think when I think about MTSS, I think about those parts, academic and behavioral. It's a possibility that with Tier 3 interventions, we may also need to target some supports and independent learning on how to manage control, our own emotions, behavior, executive functioning, those kinds of things along the way as well. And there are some examples across the grade range, including more upper grades, middle school, high school as well. So I'm going to pause there with our examples. I am going to flash a couple of resources up before I take you into your small group. So we're going to stop and as soon as we're finished with this and go into our breakout group, and I'll prompt you with something to talk about specifically. But if you're interested in more information about what I've shared with the planning structures, with the access to literacy piece, we just put together this website this past summer. So it was available in the fall. It has 10 chapters total, so it's a 10-chapter outline. And it covers everything from building dispositions in staff members, and includes things like setting up learning environments, collaborative planning for instruction at the unit, like scope and sequence level, selecting curricular tools, and in accessing literacy, language and literacy, communication, etc. It is a free resource, but you do need to set up a login for the use of that resource. Once you have your login account, you can go directly into any one of the chapters. It will look like when you get into the chapters that every one of the chapters, the pages have videos to them. So there are about 70 videos total within the site, and additional connected resources and materials also. It may look like when you get into the chapter and you open up the video that there are some pages that are locked, but if you just use the next page tab in the top left, just a little tip, you can bypass any of the pages and get directly to the page that you want to look at. So it doesn't have a lock step. You don't have to go through all the content in order to get to what you would like to get to. The Ocali website also has many resources as well. So you may see planning resources there that you are interested in checking out at all of the levels. You would just go to the Ocali website. You would go to the Teaching Diverse Learners Center page, and then you can get directly to those planning resources from there. They are also located in the site that I just shared a second ago. And then lastly, the Padlet that I kept referencing, I'll just share a quick link to that. You're welcome to check that out as well. And I can put the link, as you guys are in your breakout, I can put the link to some of these resources into the chat so you'll have access to them again. So lots of resources to kind of fall back on if you want to follow up after our conversation today. And I do want to pause for a second and get us ready for the breakout piece. We're going to do a little bit of a breakout conversation with small groups. And I'll let Shasta explain the grouping structure, but I'll prompt you kind of before you head into the group. I'm hoping that our conversation today has your wheels turning a little bit and kind of reflectively thinking a little bit about what are some areas that you would personally like to target based on your knowledge of your own placement, your own building placement, district placement, the work that you're doing currently in your own learning personally, and what you're seeing out there for students with complex disabilities. What area may you want to target and kind of think back on. And I will put into the chat a link to an idea boards. If you're not familiar with idea boards, it's just basically like a Jamboard, but it uses sticky notes to access the content. So within the idea boards, let me grab this link really quickly so you have access before you go into your breakout room. You will have access to post up some of the thoughts that you have that you may like to share with your group about some of these areas. What are some of the things you know you're going to keep on doing, using, engaging in? What are some of the things you may want to start doing from now on? Maybe things you want to stop doing or look at or investigate further. So that's where you can kind of post the ideas that occur within your conversations today. So let me grab this link really quickly here. And
And Shauna, while you're grabbing your resources there
Yep.
and dropping them in the chat, Becca will be sending us to breakout rooms to kind of
Okay.
just have these conversations and discussions and use this resource that you shared. And we'll try to come back. I know we're set to kind of like shift gears at 11:45. So Becca, are you able to hear me?
And we just have 9 more minutes left in our time together today. So if one person, 1 or 2 people from each group could quickly share out just a key point or a note, a thought that made you think, a connection that you made. Let's start with group 1.
I think I was in group 1. We just kind of talked a lot about how people don't know what they don't know. Parents, other teachers, other administrators, they may not be fully aware of the flexibility that we can have in regards to placement and participation in the general education setting. So really getting to the root of where people are coming from when they are requesting things or when they're saying things is going to be really, really important for our role as administrators in special education.
That's a really good point, Stacy. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And group 2, it's Allison, Katie, Lindsay, Alan, Daniel. Would someone like to share?
Sure, I'll share.
Thank you.
Hopefully my connection's okay and you guys can hear me. So we were very fortunate to be in a group with Katie because this is kind of her area of expertise. And I think too, like similar idea to what group 1 had talked about is, people don't know what they don't know. And, Katie had talked about how sometimes, our general education teachers who provide a lot of those tier 1 supports may not have a vast amount of knowledge about students with low incident disabilities. So like the importance of the training piece and providing them supports in order to have a full understanding and to be able to know what to do. So that was kind of like the gist of our general conversation.
Yeah, and another thing that we talked about was just strategies that we spend a lot of time in theory and we forget about practice. And that, one of the biggest barriers for our low incidence students going into the gen ed classroom is behavior. And a lot of times what we get is we'll do an FBA and a BIP, but we don't get as far as to tell teachers, what do those interventions actually look like and how do you implement them? And I think those are where those barriers come when you're thinking about inclusion.
Great, thank you. Group 3, Misty, Andrea, two Andreas, Amanda, Miranda.
We talked a little bit about the difficulty that a lot of preschool teachers find themselves in, maybe when they first enter the field, and if they don't have any special education experience, that connection where that road meets between gen ed and special ed, and how the preschool is supposed to be a fully inclusive setting, and what that actually looks like and what that actually means whenever you consider that the setting is supposed to be flexible, but there's also a schedule. And so a lot of preschool teachers end up just having difficulty navigating, like the special ed paperwork part of it, and then actually servicing those kids in the classroom and what that actually looks like.
Thank you, Miranda. Group 4, Krista, Tasha, Amy, Abby, Bridget.
This is Tasha. We kind of talked about going along with the preschool, how it was enlightening that when we were in preschool, we were serving all these children, but as soon as they hit kindergarten, they went into a special room. And then Abby was talking about she had some preschool teachers, because in Kentucky you can teach preschool or kindergarten, who moved up to kindergarten, and they were more open to having those kiddos in their room.
Thanks for speaking up, Tasha. Let's see, room 5 is next. Carmen, Melissa, Shannon, Stacy, Catherine. Oh, good, Shauna, thank you.
I'll go for our group. I guess we kind of talked a little bit about that whole maybe digging a little deeper into the tier groups to provide greater support, to giving breaking them down even further, where we can actually give them more support. I guess is basically it. I think I got that right. I don't. It was a lot of information that was given to us, and we kind of felt a little not overwhelmed, but we were like trying to still process all the information that was given. And it was all really good information, but like we were like still processing at the time. We're like, okay, what are some things that we could do, using those inclusive practices to expose our children to greater grade level standards. Those are some things that we really kind of were talking about.
Thanks, Stacy. And let's use the discussion board for those of you that still want to process some of this and share later. Let's use our discussion board for that. And we have 3 more minutes and 1 more group. Josh, Holly, Paige, Krista, would one of you like to share?
Let's see. I don't have the thing up. Hold on. Let's say we put our information into the idea board. I don't know. I don't have it up. Could one of you read what we put for that?
Yeah, some of the things that we were talking about was just finding those opportunities for peers to work together and plan those times. So when we do expose a lot of our low incident students to the tier 1 instruction, that we have the proper supports in place. And we thought that all kind of tied back to having the schedules in place to make those collaborations happen, make sure they were happening in meaningful ways, and that we were properly preparing to have everybody in the classroom to receive and be successful in tier 1.
Awesome, thank you. We have just 1 minute left. We discussed a lot today, didn't we? We learned a lot today. Bill, it looks like, is sharing the link to the evaluation for today's session. If you could, at some point before a close of business on Monday, fill that out, that would be great. And I wanted to remind you guys to, number one, continue the conversations and thoughts on the discussion board. And number two, remember that our Kentucky Leads link is recurring. So if you are going to decline one of the meetings, make sure that you just pull up that specific date, because if you decline one of the meeting requests, it'll take it off your calendar completely. If that has happened, you can always find it in the link in our SharePoint site. And on that note,
I have one thing, Becca, just to remind you all, if you have not registered, please go ahead and register for the Kentucky Lead Summit. Try to do that at least by the end of next week. If we can get everyone to register, that would be great. Thank you.
And I would just add too, if you know that you're not going to be attending or able to attend, we know it's summer, so there's like vacations and stuff. We know everybody's going to like Bora Bora and stuff. But so if you're going to be like out of the country or something, just let us know. Like just say, hey, just shoot us an email that just says that you won't be there, just so that we kind of know, who to be expecting and not, or not. Are there any final questions or anything before we go and wrap up?
Paige had
So-
a question about a contact. Pete was our contact for attendance issues. If you know that you're going to be late, or not be able to attend something, feel free to email me and I'll share with the rest of the team.
And before we go, just a shout out to Shauna. Thank you so much for today's session. We greatly appreciate your time and expertise that you've shared with our academy today. Wonderful.
Thank you guys for being here. I appreciate all the attention and the great comments and feedback. I love listening to your wrap up thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Have a great.
And just
Friday.
as a final thought, our next session is May 28th. Our topic will be MTSS and PBIS. So if you would like to know there's some particular things you want us to kind of highlight or share with our presenters beforehand, I've added that in the chat. Like there's or not the chat, but the share discussion board. So if there's something you want to hear about, there's a question you have, go ahead and drop that in the chat, and we will make sure we share that with our next month's presenters. And that's it. Thank you all so much. Bye, everybody.
Have a great weekend.
Becca,
Huh?
are you